Part 6. We're moving from Asia back over to Europe. I told you, we're bouncing around a lot. Got to keep up with me. Fascist expansion in Europe. Austria, 1938. Let me fill in a little back matter here. Hitler had done some things prior to this. The Treaty of Versailles basically said the Germans weren't allowed to have much of a military. I think they were allowed like a 100,000 man army. It's basically a self-defense force. They were allowed to have a very small navy, but the size of the ships was limited. They really weren't allowed to have an air force at all. They weren't supposed to have tanks. So the German military is very, very weak. But Hitler surreptitiously is building the military back up in violation of a treaty. And then later he kind of openly comes out and says, look, we're renouncing these restrictions. One thing he did, there was an area, notice there's a little brown thing on the map where it says occupied area. And there's a little brown spot here. There's what I call the Rhineland. It's like a border area. And there's a lot of the German industries there. There weren't supposed to be any German troops in the area. There's like Allied troops. I don't know if they're French or British, but probably French. Anyway, there's troops in the area occupying it. And maybe they left. But anyway, Hitler sends military forces into this area that was supposed to be demilitarized. And the other powers don't do anything to stop it. Well, gosh, it's German troops moving within Germany. Let's not make a big deal about it. Okay? But in 1938, Hitler wants Austria. Okay. Now, this was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Okay, at one time, prior to World War I. And then after World War I, it had been split back into its component parts, and some of these countries were carved out of the old empire. And so you have a country called Austria. Now, a lot of the people who live in Austria are ethnically German. In fact, if memory serves me correctly, I think Hitler was born in an area that's actually in Austria, but he's ethnically German. They speak German, that kind of thing. And Hitler is arguing that he thinks all the German-speaking peoples should all live together in a country called Germany, and he would like to get Austria back into annex Austria into Germany. Now, not everybody in Austria would be on board for this, but some are. There are people who think it'd be good to be part of Germany, and so there's some. This is all done politically. There's no real violence involved. There's like a vote. Austria joins Germany. Don't ask me for details. The book may provide some of them, but it's European history, so probably not. But this is known as the Anschluss, probably mispronouncing it, where Germany and Austria kind of merge together into a greater Germany. Now, the next thing on Hitler's wish list, though, involves Czechoslovakia. Here's Czechoslovakia. Now, after World War I, when they broke up the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, one of the things Wilson wanted, Woodrow Wilson, was for ethnic groups to be able to have their own little countries where possible. And it doesn't always work out, but you had the Czechs and you had the Slovaks, and they've been made into this country called Czechoslovakia, which did not exist prior to World War I. So, the thing Hitler has his eyes set on is something called the Sudetenland. See here? All right. The Sudetenland is this brown area here. This is the Sudetenland, okay? Now, there's a lot of ethnic Germans living up in, see where Germany's right here. So a lot of people living in this area are ethnically German, right? Yeah. And so Hitler's arguing that they're a ethnic minority within Czechoslovakia, that their rights are being oppressed, and he wants Czechoslovakia to sign the Sudetenland over to him. Now, the Czechs aren't keen on this, okay? First of all, there's some big cities in the Sudetenland. It's also where some of their industry is. They don't want to give up the industry. They don't want to give up cities, okay? And it's probably, I've never looked into this because I've never studied the history of Czechoslovakia, but it's probably some of the more defensible borders. And I'm imagining that when they drew up the maps after World War I, they probably picked borders that were firm and could be easily defended and that sort of thing. Okay, mountain ranges, rivers, that sort of stuff. Never really looked into it deeply. But the Czechs don't want to give up the Sudetenland. And although they're a fairly new country, they've got a pretty good army. It's not huge, but neither was the German army at this point. All right? And the Czechs have a pretty good arms industry. They made some really good tanks, and they made rifles and stuff. So they're not a really old country, but they've got a pretty good industry. And they've got a small but well-equipped military, and they might just be willing to fight for the Sudetenland. Now the problem is, if Germany and Czechoslovakia go to war over the Sudetenland, the other big countries, England, or Great Britain to be more specific, and France, are worried this could spread into a general European conflict. After all, that's how World War I started. It was a conflict between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and their Serbian neighbors, and then it exploded into a world war. And so France and Great Britain have treaty obligations and defensive pacts, and they're supposed to help protect Czechoslovakia against aggression. So they're worried that this incident could lead to a war. And so they decide to have a conference in Munich, which is a city in Germany. So this kind of it's taking place on Hitler's home field. It kind of shows maybe he's calling some of the shots here, because that's where they decide to have the conference. Okay, so let's look at that. Oops. All right. Next slide. So they decide to have this conference to establish the fate of the Sudetenland. Here's a picture taken of the conference. This guy right here is Neville Chamberlain. He is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. This is his French counterpart, whose name eludes me right now. Here's Adolf Hitler with a dapper mustache. Always easy to spot Hitler because he always sports that sporty swastika on his shoulder. Right? Now I have a little fun here. This is Benito Mussolini from Italy. Okay. Now, if this was up on the PowerPoint on the screen in front of the class, it'd be much larger. But if you look real carefully, look at Mussolini's eyes. Man, it's like he's staring right at Hitler. I always imagine him going, Hitler, Hitler, Hitler. Why does Hitler always get all the attention? What about me? All I ever hear about is, why can't you be more like Adolf Hitler? It's like being the younger brother. Why can't you be more like your older brother Adolf? Okay, I'm having some fun. But I mean, it really does look like he's looking over like, jeez, Hitler always gets to be in the center of a photo. So, anyway, we have representatives from Great Britain, from France, from Germany, and from Italy. I love this pen thing. Who's missing? Now, if we were having class, and I miss not having a class in front of me, but if we were having class, I'd say, who's missing? And usually somebody says, the United States. I'll go, well, yeah, but we're not interested in what's going on in Europe. We're at home worried about the Depression. Say, but anyone else? And sometimes somebody gets in and say, hey, what about the Czechs? Yeah, they haven't invited the Czechs to this conference because they know the Czechs will fight for the Sudetenland. And so their presence in the conference could really rile things up. Okay? So it's like they don't get to have a say in what's happening in their own country. So they work out this agreement. Hitler's like going, I just want the Sudetenland. I get that. I got all the Germans back in Germany. I'll be happy. I don't anticipate asking for any more territory. I'll have restored Germany to where it's supposed to be. Yeah. So they work out this agreement to give the Sudetenland to the Germans. Neville Chamberlain gets on an airplane, flies back to Great Britain, gets off the airplane with this piece of paper. Right? I went and found a better or a bigger picture of this to show you. Okay, so here's an airplane. Here's the tail. There's Neville Chamberlain here. Here's his piece of paper, right? And he goes up there to the microphone. You saw it in the picture on the earlier slide. And he says, this paper is an agreement signed, with the Germans. And here it is. Now, if we were on the PowerPoint, you could see it. It's kind of small here. But I've got it up on the other screen, so I'll read it for you. It says, we, the German Führer and Chancellor. Now, Führer is German for leader. Chancellor is Hitler's official job, right? He's Chancellor of Germany. If you look on his business card, it says, Adolf Hitler, Chancellor of Germany. Okay, so let's start over again. It says, we, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a thorough meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night, that would be the Munich Agreement to give Sudetenland to Germany. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which was a side agreement that the Germans and the English had made, and I don't know the details on that one. It's a little side agreement they came up with, as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again. Final paragraph. It says, we are resolved that the method of consultation shall be the method adopted to deal with any other questions that may concern our two countries, and we are determined to continue our efforts to remove possible sources of difference and thus to contribute to assure the peace of Europe. So, any problems, we'll talk it out because we want, to avoid a war. And, just to show how legitimate it is, here it is, signed by Adolf Hitler and Neville Chamberlain. All right? And hey, if you can't trust Adolf Hitler, I mean, come on, who can you trust? All right? Chamberlain waves his piece of paper. This is not the actual piece of paper, by the way. It's a prop. He says, this paper guarantees, he says, peace in our time. This dated September 30th, 1938. World War II is 11 months away. Now, why would Chamberlain do this? This, by the way, goes down as appeasement. The idea that if you give a bully or a dictator what he wants, that he'll somehow leave you alone. It doesn't work that way. He'll come back for more later. You can't appease people like Adolf Hitler. And so this becomes known as appeasement after the war. And it has forever hung over Neville Chamberlain's, history, not history, but his image. Neville Chamberlain had a long, distinguished career serving the British Crown. I think his father did as well, as I recall. I think his brother did. The Chamberlain family had been loyal servants to the British country for decades. But this is what he'll get remembered for, is appeasement. Now, why would the British do this? Well, I didn't talk about this when we did World War I because we're talking about the U.S., right? So we didn't really talk about the British stuff. But World War I was horrible, right? The British lost in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme River. They lost 20,000 men killed on the first day. And that was just the first day. Second day, we continued. Battle went on for weeks. The worst casualties were on the first day. But anyway, the British would do anything to prevent that sort of thing from happening again. Even if it means selling the Czechs down the river. The Czechs, realizing if they fight Hitler, will have to fight by themselves. Let him have the Sudetenland. Later on in the year, Hitler invades Czechoslovakia and gobbles up the rest of it. He's broken his promise. And that's where we'll stop for another video.